Welcome back to MonsterTamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, for our cutscenes and in-game events feature, we worked on defining our event structure that we want to use for our in-game events. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. So now that we defined our event structure for our game, and we've updated our world scene to pull our events by ID into our world scene, we now need to start updating our world scene to handle our various events. Before we get started with that, one of the things we've added is we added this new ID field that we'll be using for our NPCs. So we're going to start off by updating our NPC class to support this new field. Let's open up our NPC class. If we come to the top of our class, let's add a new property to our class. We're going to call this ID, so I'm just going to copy this here, we'll paste it, and we'll do a private property, we'll do ID, and we'll do a number for our value. We'll want this to be passed in when we create an instance, so let's come to our configuration properties, we'll copy this, let's paste it. We'll change this to ID, and let's make this a number. Now down in our constructor, let's go ahead and add in that value. So we'll do this.id is going to be equal to our config, and then we'll expect ID to be there. One last change we're going to make is let's add a getter so we can easily get our ID. I'm going to copy our getter here. Let's paste it and change this to be ID. And this will return a number, and let's return this ID. So now if we jump over to our world scene, let's update where we create our NPC to pass in our ID field. So if we add an ID, we'll use our NPC ID from here. Now that we've updated our NPC, next we want to update our data manager to keep track of which events we have viewed in our game. So let's go into our data manager.js file, and at the top of our file, let's start with our global state. Let's add in a new field to keep track of our events. I'm going to copy this here for items picked up. We'll paste it. This will be a string array, and we'll do viewed events. Now if we come down to our initial state, let's add that in. So we'll do viewed events. We'll make that an empty array. Let's add a new property for that to our store key. So we'll copy this, we'll paste it. Let's do viewed events. And now let's update our class to use this new property. So if we come down to our start new game method, let's do our existing data. We'll do our viewed events, and we're going to set that equal to our initial state. And we'll do viewed events. Next, we come down to the bottom of our class. We'll go up to where we update our data manager. Let's copy our field here. We'll paste it. Let's do viewed events, and we'll do our data viewed events, or we'll fall back to our initial state. And then let's come down to our last method, and let's just copy this. We'll go ahead and paste that. Let's do viewed events, and we'll do viewed events, and we'll fall back to an empty array if we don't find any data. Finally, let's add in a new method so when we view an event, we can pass that ID to our data manager, and we'll update our store. So we come up to where we have our public properties, let's add a new method. Let's do viewed event. For this, we'll have one argument. It'll be event ID. All right, so for our method, we're going to want to grab any of the events we've already stored, and then we'll want to add our new event ID to this. Instead of just using an array, we're going to use a set. Then that way we guarantee that we're only adding our ID one time to the data we store. To do this, let's copy our logic from our add items picked up method. We'll paste that. For our type, let's change this to a set, and we're going to do a string. Let's get rid of our array. For our variable, we'll do viewed events. And we'll do this store.get. We want to do viewed events. And now we want to convert this to a set. So since we have an array, we could do new set. We'll pass in our array. Now we can do viewed events, and we'll do add. We want to pass in our event ID. And now we want to take our set and convert it back to an array, and we'll store that in our data manager. So now we're going to do our viewed events, and we'll do array from our viewed events. All right, and so by using a set, this is going to make sure for our array that we're storing, we don't put any duplicates inside there. Now that we've updated our data manager, let's jump over to a world scene. And when we create our event zones, let's update our to-do to pull this data from our data manager. So we'll do data manager, we'll reference our store, let's do get, and for our keys, let's do our viewed events. We'll get rid of our to-do. So now once we add in support for storing which event we've seen and we restart our phaser scene, we'll pull this data from our data manager, and then we'll skip creating our event zones in our scene. Just to test this, we come into our data manager, let's come to our initial events. So for our initial viewed events, all right, so if we add in 1, if we save our scene and refresh, you'll see now our event zone isn't created. And if we add in 2, we should now have no event zones in our game. All right, and to fix our IntelliSense error, let's come up to our type definition. We want to change this to be a number, since when we created our data in tiled, we use the integer field instead of a string. So now if we come down to our method for where we do our viewed event, let's update that as well, just so it stays consistent. And this will be a set of numbers. All right, one last change has come up to our initial data. Let's remove our 1 and 2 from our viewed events. Let's save and we'll jump back over to a world scene. Next up for our world scene, now we need to add in our logic for processing our events from our events JSON. In our events JSON, our events is an array of objects, and in our code, we're going to want to process each of these events one at a time. And then based on our type, we're going to do different things in our game. For many of these, we want to wait until this event is completed before we move on to our next event in our array. Only once we finish processing all of those objects do we want to say, hey, we're done with this event. Now we can continue letting our player interact in our game. To iterate through this, we're going to need to keep track of our index of where we're at in our array, and then that way we can increment it as we complete each event, and then that way we can create our event loop for processing our events. For this, let's jump over to a world scene. Let's add some new properties to our class to keep track of where we're at when we're processing our events. So at the top of our class, first, let's add a property to keep track of which ID we're processing for our events. And so for this, we'll call this current cutscene ID. Next, we're going to add a property to keep track if we're currently processing an event. And so this will help for things like we're moving our NPCs around. Since that's going to take time to move our NPC from one position to another, we want to pause handling our next event in our loop here. So we're going to call this isProcessingCutsceneEvent. Finally, we need to keep track of the index of the event that we process, so then when we come back to our loop, we'll grab the next one from our array. We'll call this lastCutsceneEventHandledIndex. So for our types, I'm going to copy our type here. Our current cutscene ID will be a number, our index will be a number, and then we'll have a Boolean for our flag. So now if we come down to our end a minute, let's add in our default values. So we're going to do this, we'll do our current cutscene ID, we're going to set it equal to undefined. Just going to copy this. We'll paste it twice. Next, we'll do our isProcessingCutsceneEvent. We're going to set this equal to false, and then we'll have our last cutscene event handled index, and let's do -1. Now that we have our new properties, let's come back down to our handle player movement update method. And in our to-do for doing our cutscene support, let's get rid of our console logs here. Now let's store our reference to our cutscene ID. So we'll do this. Our current cutscene ID is going to be equal to our zone.name. And so we'll convert that to a number. So we're going to do parse int. We'll have our zone name. And now let's call a new method to start processing our events. We're going to do this, and we'll do start cutscene. Let's copy our method name. We'll come down to the bottom of our class. Let's add that in. All right, so before we start our cutscene, we want to lock our input so our player can't actually move our character once we start our cutscene. To this, we're going to use our new flag. We're going to do isProcessingCutsceneEvent. We'll set equal to true. And once we do that, this is where we're going to show our new black bars in our scene, so then that way it looks like we're just viewing an in-game event. And so to simulate that for the time being, we're just going to use our sleep function to have us wait before we go to our next cutscene event. So let's do a wait, we're going to do sleep, let's do 500 milliseconds, and then we're going to do this for our current scene. We'll want to make this async. And so once that's done, now we want to process our next event. So let's add a new method, and we're going to do handle cutscene interaction. Let's add that new method to our class. We'll also make that async as well. Oh, and we'll make that private, and let's save. All right, so now in our method, we'll want to grab our events from our data utils. So let's do const, we're going to do events to process. We're going to set it equal to our data utils. Let's do get event data. We'll do this, we'll pass in this, our current cutscene ID. Oh, if we jump over to our get event data, let's change this to be a number as well. We'll save, we'll come back to our scene. Let's just do a console log, and we're going to do events to process. Just to make sure everything is connected, let's come into our game, let's move our player. We should see after we move our player, after our 500 milliseconds, we now log out, our events we're processing. All right, so now that we have our events we want to process, we're going to increment our last cutscene event handled index by 1. And what that will do is, since we start off at -1, when we grab our next event, it's going to have index 0, so it's going to let us do that. When we come back to our method again to process our next event, we'll be at 1, and then we'll just keep processing until we get to the end of our array. So now let's grab a reference to the event we want to process. We'll do event to handle. We're going to set it equal to our events to process, the events, and we'll do our last cutscene event handled index. Let's grab a reference to our type. So we'll do event type. We're going to set it equal to our event to handle, and we'll do type. Now, depending on which type of event we're processing, we're going to want to do different things. So let's add in our switch statement. We'll do our event type. Now we'll add in our various cases. We'll have case. We'll do our game event type. Let's do add NPC. And we'll do break. I'm just going to copy this and add in our various types. So we'll have move to player, retrace path, remove NPC, talk to player, and then we'll have give monster. Now let's add in our default block, and we'll do our exhaustive guard, just to make sure we cover all our cases, and we'll do our event type. Oh, we have our two other cases for our flags. Let's add those in real quick. So we'll do add flag, and we'll do remove flag. All right, so for each of these event types, since we're doing different things, we're going to create a method for each one of these. So we'll start off with add NPC. For this, we'll make a new method. We'll do this. We'll do create NPC for cutscene. Then we'll pass in our event to handle. Let's copy this, and we'll add this to each of our blocks. And for now, we'll just skip our add flag and remove flag blocks. So to move to player, we'll do move NPC to player. Then we'll do have NPC retrace path. We'll do remove NPC for cutscene. Then we'll have NPC talk to player. And now we'll do add monster from NPC. I'm going to copy our method name. Let's come down here. We'll add in our new method. We'll have game event for our argument. And now I'm going to add in my JS doc types real quick. So for our game event, this will be our game event add NPC. And we'll do at returns. And this will be void since we won't return anything. I'm going to copy this, and let's paste this a few times. Now we just want to update our method names to match our other method names. So we'll have move NPC to player. We'll have our NPC retrace our path. Remove NPC for cutscene. Have NPC talk to player. We'll need one more block, so let's copy that. And we'll do add monster from NPC. Now let's just update our types real quick. So for our move NPC, this will be our game event, move to player. We'll have game event, retrace path. Then we'll have game event, remove NPC, game event, talk to player, then game event, give monster. All right, so for each of the methods we just added, we'll need to add in our logic for processing that particular event. And once we're done processing it, we'll want to reset our flag, our is processing cutscene event equal to false. And then we need to call our handle cutscene interaction method again, so then that way we process our next event. Instead of adding all our logic at this time, let's just add a console log statement, and we'll simulate that we're waiting for the event to complete, and then that we can make sure our chain is working how we expect. So I'm just going to do console log. I'm going to log out our method name, so we'll see that it got invoked. Now we'll do this, we'll reference our scene, we'll do time, let's do delayed call, and let's just do 500 milliseconds. And after our callback is invoked, we'll do this, we'll do is processing cutscene event, we'll set equal to false. And now let's call our method again. So we'll do this, and we'll do handle cutscene interaction. Let's copy these lines of code to our other methods. And then we'll just update our console log statement. So we'll just update our method names. And so one last change we need to make is let's come up to our switch statement. And once we get to our add flag and remove flag so our code don't break, let's just invoke our method again. All right, so one last change we need to do before we can test our new code is in our handle scene interaction method, we need to add logic for once we reach the end of our array, that this would trigger the end of our cutscene. So currently we're just going to keep updating our index, and eventually we're going to reach the end of our array and our index will be out of bounds. So before we increment our index, let's check to see if we're at the end of our array. So we'll do const, we'll make a new variable, we'll do is more events to process. We're going to set equal to our events to process. We'll grab our events, let's do our length, we'll subtract 1, that way we have our size. If it does not equal our last cutscene event handled index, then we know we're not done. And so if we don't have any more events to process, we'll want to go ahead and reset our index. So let's copy this here. We're going to set that equal to -1. Next, we'll update our flag for processing our event. So we'll do this is processing cutscene event. We'll set that equal to false. Now we'll want to update our data manager to show that we viewed this event. So we'll do our data manager. Let's do viewed event. We'll pass in our event ID. So we'll do this, our current cutscene ID. Once we add our cutscene ID to our data manager, we can reset our property back to undefined. So we'll do this, our current cutscene ID will be equal undefined. And now we want to end our cutscene. So with our black bars that are on our screen, we'll want those to go away. And so for now, we're just going to add a to-do. So we'll do to-do, we'll do end cutscene. To simulate that, we'll do await, we'll do sleep, and we'll do our 500 milliseconds. And then we'll need to pass in our scene for reference. Then we can return early from our method, since we don't have any more code to run. All right, so now we have our logic in place. We should be able to test our changes. So if we save and refresh our browser, if we move our character, we'll see now in our console log, we'll start grabbing our events. We're going to process them one by one. And then we go through our various methods. We create our NPC, we move our player, and we go all the way down to where we remove our NPC. And now if we move our player again, we'll see we have an issue where we start processing our event again. Even though we've updated our data manager, we still have our phaser game objects for our zone, and so we need to clean those up from our game. Alright, so to clean up our game objects, we'll go right before we do our cutscene ID and we set it to equal to undefined. First, we'll clean up our event zones. We'll do this. We're going to do our event zones. Let's grab our event zone by its ID. So we'll do this. We'll do our current cutscene ID. Now we'll use the destroy method to clean up our phaser game object. Once we clean up our game object, now we want to remove this from our object. So we'll do delete this, event zones, and now we'll do this, and we'll do our current cutscene ID. One last thing we'll do is we're going to reset our graphics that shows the outline of where we have that overlap between our player and our event zone. So we're going to just do if our enable zone debugging is set to true, then we'll reference our graphics game object, and we'll do clear. So now back in our browser, if we move our player, we should see that we process our events. Once we're done, now we clear our game objects, and if we move, we don't trigger our event again. Oh, and one thing we need to do is we need to clean up our debug zones. So if we come to our code, let's do this. We'll do our debug event zones. We'll do this, our current cutscene ID, and let's call destroy. And then we'll also want to delete that object as well. So I'm just going to move this down. We'll keep our code together. I'm just going to copy this. Let's paste it here. We'll update our reference. And for this, we'll want to wrap this in our if statement as well. So I'm just going to grab this code. Let's come up here. We'll paste it, and we'll put this inside our block. And now we'll save. So we'll do one more quick test. If we move our player, we'll see we process our events. Once we're done, we clean up our game objects. And if we move our player around, since we cleaned up our zone, we no longer trigger our cutscene. So now that we have our main event processing working, we need to add a few safeguards to our logic. So if we come over to our scene and refresh, if we move our player and we trigger our cutscene, we're still able to move our player around. And now this causes issues since we start invoking our cutscene processing multiple times. Once we start our cutscene, we actually want to lock our player's input so they can't move around our scene. To add this logic, let's come up to our update method. So after we grab a reference to our keys that can be pressed, before we process our input, let's see if we're processing our event. So we'll do this is processing cutscene event because we want this to take precedence over anything else in our game. Alright, so for processing our event, we'll still want to call the update method on our player and our NPCs. Primarily, we'll still want to have our characters be animated while we're processing this cutscene event. To do that, we're just going to do this.player. We'll call our update method. We'll pass in time. Then for NPCs, we'll do this.npcs. We'll do for each. For each of our NPCs, we'll do NPC update, and we'll pass in time. Finally, we'll still want to support having the player press the space key, and then that way, when our NPC is talking to our player, we can process that input. So we'll do if, we'll do was space key pressed, and this will have NPC players interacting with. If that's set, that means we are talking to an NPC. We'll do this, and we'll do handle player interaction. And then finally, we'll return early if we're processing our event. All right, so one last change we need to make is we need to come down to where we handle when we are done with our messages and our dialog modal. So in our handle player interaction, once we check to see if our dialog modal is visible and if we're done with our messages and we hide our modal, if we have a cutscene, we want to call our method to process our next event. So once our NPC is done talking to our player, instead of our game going back to normal, we want to grab our next event from our events JSON. For this, we're going to do this. We'll do our current cutscene ID. If it does not equal undefined, if it does not equal undefined, we'll know we're still in the middle of a cutscene. And so we'll do this. We'll do is processing cutscene event. We're going to set equal to false. And now we'll do handle cutscene interaction. So two other changes we need to make is let's come down to our handle player movement update method. Right before we check to see if there's an encounter layer, let's add a check to see if we're handling one of our cutscene IDs. So we're going to do if this, our current cutscene ID, does not equal undefined, then we don't want to continue processing, and so we can just return early. Finally, let's come down to our isPlayerInputLocked method, and let's just add in a check to make sure we're not processing our cutscene ID. So this current cutscene ID does not equal undefined, then we'll also lock our player input. Alright, then finally, we're just going to add a few safeguards to our handle cutscene interaction method. So we come down to our code. So we have an issue with our events to process. We can remove this line of code here for when we trigger our cutscene, since we don't need our events to process here. All right, so we go back down to our method. All right, so in our method, the first thing we'll do is if we're already in the middle of processing a cutscene event, we don't want to trigger the next event to be processed. We want to wait till it's finished. So we're going to do this. We'll do if this is processing cutscene event. So if that's true, we'll just do return. Next, we'll want to make sure we actually have a cutscene ID. So we'll do if this current cutscene ID is equal to undefined, then we'll do a return. Lastly, after we grab the event that we need to process, we'll reset our isProcessingCutscene to be true. And then that way we'll reset this down in our various methods once we're done processing our event. All right, so one last change is since we have this check here for isProcessingCutscene event, in our start cutscene method, we'll want to reset this after our sleep method. So we'll set it equal to false. All right, so one last change we need to make is now that we're checking for isProcessingCutscene event to be true at the top of our method, we'll want to make sure we reset this between each of our interactions. So up in our start cutscene method, we'll want to reset it after we wait for our cutscene to play. So we'll set it equal to false. Then down in our switch statement, since we don't have any logic for our add flags here, we're going to want to set this equal to false before we call our method again. Now back in our scene, if we move our player, we should see after 500 milliseconds, we get all of our various events. And once we're done processing our array, we clean up everything in our game and our player can continue moving. We refresh our scene, let's trigger our cutscene. And now if we try moving our player, we'll see our input is locked and we're not able to do anything until we're done processing our events. Alright, with that last change, that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to continue working on our logic and processing our events from our events JSON. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phasor 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.